He stood in the middle of a dance studio, shoes soaked through with his own blood, legs shaking, lungs burning, and he kept going. Not because a director told him to. Not because a camera was rolling. But because somewhere in the walls of that house, his uncle's ghost was watching. And Jaafar Jackson was not about to let him down. This is the story the world thought it understood. A nephew steps into the greatest shoes in entertainment history. Simple enough, right? Except nothing about this was simple. Nothing about this was clean. Nothing about this was the kind of story you walk away from unchanged. Because what Jaafar Jackson went through to become Michael Jackson in the 2026 biopic, the real version, not the polished press tour version, was the kind of ordeal that breaks ordinary people before they even reach day 3. He didn't just learn the moonwalk. He bled for it. He starved for it. He lost himself inside it so completely that by the end, he had to consciously teach himself how to be Jaafar again. And the world had absolutely no idea. They thought it was a casting decision. A family favor. A PR-friendly choice that made sense on paper because the last name matched. They thought Jaafar Jackson got handed something. They thought this was a privilege wrapped in a bow, delivered to a nephew who simply showed up and smiled and looked enough like his uncle to make it work on screen. Every single one of those people was wrong. The process began not in a casting room, not on a dance floor, not in front of a panel of producers with clipboards and opinions. It began with a voice note. One quiet, unassuming voice note sent to producer Graham King, recorded by a man who had never stood on a professional film set a single day in his life. Jaafar Jackson wasn't pursuing the role. He wasn't running a campaign. He wasn't lobbying through connections or calling in family favors. He recorded himself speaking in a way that felt true, and he sent it off, and then he waited. When King heard that recording, he stopped moving. He played it again. Then again. Then he picked up his phone and called back immediately. Later, he would describe the moment plainly. He felt something in the recording that was unmistakably, undeniably Michael. Not an impression. Not an imitation. Something deeper than either of those things. Something that lived in the bones of Jaafar's voice the way certain things are passed down without being taught. That voice note cracked open 2 years of searching in a single listen. Because the search had been brutal. Graham King and director Antoine Fuqua had looked at nearly 200 candidates. Professional impersonators who had devoted decades to perfecting a single gesture. Trained actors with impressive resumes and undeniable screen presence. Viral performers who could replicate the choreography with machine-like precision. None of them had it. None of them carried the thing that couldn't be rehearsed. The project sat in an uncomfortable silence for months, the lead role empty like a room where something important used to live. King reportedly told people close to him that they were looking for a needle in a haystack that might not actually exist. The fear started to grow that maybe the only person who could truly play Michael Jackson was Michael Jackson himself. Then came the voice note. Then came Jaafar. And the real work hadn't even started yet. When the call came, Jaafar Jackson had never wanted to be an actor. He said this himself, directly, without embarrassment. Graham King apparently asked him point blank during their first conversation, "Have you acted before?" And Jaafar's answer was simple. Never. Not once. Not even a little. He had no technique to fall back on, no training to lean against, no muscle memory built from years of taking classes and performing scenes and learning the craft. What he had instead was something rarer. He had nothing to protect. He had no pre-existing habits to unlearn, no ego tied to a particular method, no fear of looking foolish in front of a coach. He walked into the preparation process as a completely blank surface, and the team began filling that surface with everything Michael was. Acting coaches broke him down to his most basic emotional responses and rebuilt him from the foundation upward. He dissected dialogue the way his uncle once dissected rhythm, hunting for the thing underneath the thing, searching for the wound hiding beneath every word. The learning curve was nearly vertical, and Jaafar treated every inch of it like a personal dare. But the acting was only half the battle. The dancing was the other half, and the dancing nearly ended him. Michael Jackson's movement is not something you can fake. You cannot approximate it and hope people don't notice. The angles are specific. The weight distribution is specific. The timing is so precise that a single beat off in either direction changes everything. It becomes wrong in a way that the entire world, having grown up watching the real thing, feels instantly in their gut without being able to name what's missing. The standards were absolute. The room for error was essentially zero. Jaafar Jackson danced until his feet bled. He said this himself. Not metaphorically. Not as a figure of speech meant to communicate effort. He meant it literally. He would rehearse until the skin broke, until his loafers were stained through, until his toes had blistered so badly they stopped hurting and went numb. Which, if you know anything about physical training, you know numb is worse than pain because numb means the damage has gone somewhere deeper. The shoes were a particular kind of torture. Michael's iconic performance loafers had completely smooth soles. No rubber grip. No tread. No forgiveness. They were engineered to glide across a stage like something that defied gravity, and that glide came at a cost that most people never thought about because they only ever saw the finished product on stage under lights. Every wrong pivot on those shoes punished Jaafar with fresh blisters. Every misjudged spin came back as bruising that showed up overnight and refused to heal. He kept going anyway. Every single day, he kept going. And then there was the stamina problem. Dancing in rehearsal is one thing. Sustaining that dancing across 25 takes of the same sequence, starting at 6 in the morning, with identical energy at take 1 and identical energy at take 25, that is a completely different discipline. That is an athletic demand that most professional dancers find staggering, let alone a first-time actor who learned the moves from scratch. Jaafar had to become something close to a professional athlete not because anyone asked him to, but because the role required it. He learned to weaponize rest. He studied his own energy cycles the way a competitive runner studies splits, figuring out exactly when to switch off completely so he could come fully back online when the camera needed him. By the time principal photography was properly underway, the crew around him was watching someone who had rebuilt his body for a single purpose. Take 1 and take 25 looked the same. Every time. But the physical transformation was only the surface of what was happening to Jaafar Jackson during those years of preparation. What was happening underneath was stranger, more complicated, and in some ways more disturbing than bloody feet and exhausted muscles. He moved back into Havenhurst. For those who don't know the name, Havenhurst is the Jackson family compound. It is the sprawling property where Michael Jackson grew up, where Thriller was conceived, where the Jackson family's most private moments happened behind walls the public never got to see inside. Jaafar didn't just visit the property to train. He lived there. He slept there. He moved between different rooms in the house deliberately, searching for something he could only describe as energy, the residual presence of a man who had once walked those same floors. He refused a proper bed. He put down a thin Japanese mattress directly on the floor and slept that way, night after night, trying to absorb the atmosphere of a place his uncle had inhabited. He wandered the estate in the quiet hours. He sat in the old dance studio where Michael used to train and let the silence of it press against him. He was trying to feel something that couldn't be taught. And then there was the research room. At some point during the preparation, Jaafar converted a spare room at Havenhurst into something that director Antoine Fuqua later described as looking like a scene out of the film A Beautiful Mind. Walls covered completely, choreography diagrams, handwritten notes, affirmations scrawled in every available space, timelines, and photographs and question marks and arrows connecting things to other things. A room that looked like the interior of someone's obsession made physical. But the most significant breakthrough came when the Jackson estate gave Jaafar access to something that almost no one outside the immediate family had ever seen. Michael's private journals. Handwritten. Personal. Unfiltered in a way that a person only writes when they believe no one else will ever read what they're putting down. Poems with hidden wounds inside them. Daily mantras. Fears admitted in ink that might never have been spoken out loud. Jaafar described encountering those journals as a breaking point. He began mirroring the practice himself, covering the walls of his research room with his own affirmations, his own notes, his own private declarations, until there wasn't a single inch of visible paint left. The boundary between his psychology and his uncle's began to blur. He stopped preparing for a role and started occupying a man's interior world. The distinction between the two things, between performance and possession, became genuinely difficult to locate. His family knew almost nothing about any of this. For a full year, Jaafar told his mother nothing. Not a word. His father, Jaafar Jackson, Michael's brother, the man who shared a childhood and a stage and a lifetime of music with him, had only the vaguest sense that his son was working on something significant. But Jaafar's mother was kept completely in the dark for 12 months while her son was living inside another man's identity, bleeding through his shoes, sleeping on a floor in a dead legend house, covering walls with the private thoughts of his uncle. He made that choice deliberately. He understood that the moment she found out, the full weight of what this meant, the scrutiny, the expectation, the risk, the public nature of every potential failure, would land on her, and she would carry it the way mothers carry things, quietly and constantly, and at cost to herself. He needed to find Michael in the mirror before family could see the reflection. He needed to be sure before he let the people he loved become afraid on his behalf. When he finally brought her to set, it was disorienting for her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Watching her son collapse his own posture into Michael's shy, slightly inward tilt. Hearing the particular soft register of his voice shifting into something she recognized from a different person entirely. Seeing her child and her late brother-in-law occupying the same body at the same time. She described being deeply protective of him, knowing what the attention would bring. And she wasn't wrong to feel that way. The most awaited verdict, though, belonged to someone else. Jaafar Jackson had not seen the finished film as of Jaafar's most recent interviews. That fact sat in Jaafar's chest like a stone he couldn't put down. Because Jaafar doesn't just have opinions about Michael Jackson the icon. He has memories of Michael Jackson the boy. He watched his brother become the thing the world called the king of pop from close enough to see the cost of it. No screenplay can manufacture that kind of knowledge, and no performance can hide from it. When Jaafar finally watches this film, every gesture Jaafar makes will be measured against something the audience will never have access to, the actual private truth of who his brother was. That is the harshest possible audience. And Jaafar knows it. What sustained him through the hardest stretches wasn't ambition. It wasn't discipline, exactly, though the discipline was real and extraordinary. What sustained him was a question he asked himself every single morning, particularly on the mornings when his body felt too wrecked to stand properly. What would Michael do? It functioned like a whip and a prayer simultaneously. It called up the image of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to stop at the point where stopping would have been completely reasonable. A man whose perfectionism was almost cruel in its demands, not just on the people around him, but on himself, first and always. Jaafar inherited that standard not as a burden but as a scripture. He read it every day. He lived by it through every punishing rehearsal, every numb-footed morning, every take 25 delivered with the same fire as take 1. The on-set relationships helped him survive the psychological weight of it. Coleman Domingo, playing Joseph Jackson, walked up to Jaafar on one of the early shoot days and simply hugged him. Without words, without preamble, with a warmth and protectiveness that had nothing to do with his character and everything to do with one human being recognizing what another human being was carrying. Jaafar described feeling that love moved through him like something physical. Nia Long, as Catherine Jackson, brought a maternal presence to the set that unlocked something Jaafar hadn't known he needed. He called those moments deeply emotional. Having those anchors, those human beings who showed up with genuine warmth in a process that was otherwise relentlessly demanding, gave him a safety net. It allowed him to fall into the darkest corners of Michael's story without completely losing himself in them. Because the story had dark corners, the film almost didn't survive. The original version of the biopic contained scenes directly addressing the 1,993 allegations. Sequences that Antoine Fuqua had shot with intention and care, scenes designed to sit with the discomfort that the allegations created rather than looking away from it. During editing, the Jackson estate discovered a clause buried in a decades-old legal settlement that explicitly prohibited any depiction of the Chandler family in future films. The footage was legally unusable. The production scrambled into 22 days of reshoots that cost somewhere between $10 and $50 million, much of it covered by the estate. The third act was rebuilt from scratch, ending the story in the late 1980s, before any of the public controversy had surfaced. Fuqua called it a punch in the gut. A story he had prepared to tell that he was suddenly unable to tell. The finished film became, in some ways, a document defined partly by what it cannot say, a silence that exists in the frame even when the frame is full of music and movement and light. Jaafar's performance fills that silence without pretending it isn't there. The fan community never gave him a moment's peace during the preparation period, and he was honest about that. From the moment the casting became public, online forums turned forensic. His jawline, his gait, his vocal range at various ages captured in family videos. His existing footage from years prior dissected for evidence either way. He knew they were watching before he had made a single move in the role. His response to that was unexpected. He started studying their archives. The fan community, it turned out, had preserved things even the estate had forgotten. Specific gestural details from performances decades old. Obscure backstage footage. The way Michael held his hands during a particular type of song versus a different type. The precise angle of a specific hat tilt in a specific year. Jaafar absorbed it all. He turned their obsessive watching into a resource. Their demand for perfection became the rhythm he trained to, the metronome counting out every hour of every day he spent in that studio. There is a moment from the shoot that people who were present describe with a kind of hushed reverence. During a sequence built around the song Man in the Mirror, Jaafar completed an unbroken take, drenched in sweat and physically trembling with the effort of holding the emotion together through the entire song. He opened his eyes when it was over. The soundstage had gone completely still. Camera operators were crying. The extras had stopped acting. Nobody moved. Antoine Fuqua forgot to call cut. The silence stretched out and nobody wanted to break it because breaking it would mean returning to the ordinary world, and nobody in that room was ready to go back there yet. In that moment, as one crew member later put it, they weren't looking at a nephew. They weren't looking at a performer doing an impression. They were looking at something that shouldn't have been possible, and it was standing right there under the lights, still holding the last note of the song in its chest. The most significant validation came from someone who almost never says anything publicly. Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, the woman who raised him in a small house in Gary, Indiana, who watched him become the thing he became and stayed his mother through all of it, was brought to set quietly. No fanfare. No prepared moment. She arrived and she watched, and what she saw was not just her grandson in costume. It was her grandson in the middle of rehearsal, in the private unguarded moments between takes, carrying something in his body and his bearing that she recognized from a different lifetime. She didn't speak right away. A long silence filled the room, and then she whispered to the person beside her, "It's like seeing a ghost." The official statement from the Jackson estate came later, and it used a single sentence that cut through everything else. "Jaafar embodies my son." For a man who had spent years inside an ordeal that most people would not survive, those 4 words were the only review that ever truly mattered. When the final scene wrapped, Jaafar didn't celebrate. He walked to his trailer alone, took off the loafers that had cost him more skin than he could reasonably account for, and sat in the quiet. He didn't move for a while. He said later that he had to consciously, deliberately learn how to be Jaafar again, that the role had lived in him so completely and for so long that its absence felt like a missing limb, a phantom weight where something enormous used to be. His writing music now. His own music, in his own voice, not blended with anyone else's. He talks about his uncle's legacy the way you talk about something that shaped you so profoundly that it lives in you permanently, but that you also have to hold at some distance in order to function. He says plainly that he will always carry Michael. But he cannot stay inside him forever. The biopic is his offering. 3 years of blood and sleeplessness and floors instead of beds and journals and walls covered in handwriting and shoes that punished him for every imperfect step. He gave all of it to his uncle's memory without being asked to give anything other than a voice note. And when someone asks him what he hopes Michael would think, watching all of this from wherever legends go after everything is over, Jaafar's answer comes quiet and certain. He would hope his uncle would see the love inside every spin, every sacrifice, every morning where the answer to whether he could stand up was not immediately obvious, but the question of what Michael would do was. He would hope his uncle would recognize someone who understood. The world thought it knew how hard this would be. It had no idea. But Jaafar Jackson knew exactly how hard it would be, and he did it anyway. Quietly. Completely. Until there was nothing left of the distance between a nephew and a ghost. Until the ghost came back.